Mr. Sawada, about the medium-term management strategy, I know that you have been leading the company, you will be leading the company for many years to come. But I wanted to ask about the structure of the organization. To be more specific, you might say, oh, not about entity data again. You might, not again, but my understanding about entity data is that for the past 15 to 25 years, very little synergy was realized with that company. That is because the structure of the company and the elements of the operation, there are many factors. And I think it's going to be impossible for you to realize synergy with entity data. So there's a very strange demarcation in both, and you're actually a drag on each other. So why not sell off the company? And why not find a new partner? I think that's probably better for the growth of the respective companies. That's my view, especially in the recent. It's been a couple of years since you became the president of the company. And the latter half of Mr. Unoda's administration, they had a task force. But despite those deliberations, you had no concrete output. And I really can't expect any concrete output going forward. So what is the meaning of hanging on to entity data? What are your thoughts about my proposal that you sell off your stake in entity data? I would appreciate your response. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kikuchi, for this question. It's a very bold view. To be quite candid, as far as entity data is concerned, have I ever considered selling off of entity data? I have given that a thought. But entity data from your perspective and entity data from my perspective probably are different. I think we view entity data in a different way. But what about the future? Entity data is thinking that they want to focus on consulting, and the world of IT is shifting to software. For example, Everest is right now providing the back-end system for Telefonica. Naturally, this can be delivered in the 5G world as well. So we are now partnering with NEC in creating various systems, and that system can now be sold by Everest, could be sold by entity data. That model is now becoming more visible. So when we take a look at the future, there is indeed a universe where such synergy can be more easily created. So right now, the focus is on consulting, system integration that is focused on consultation and consulting. It's important that they be part of entity group. It's important that we have such system integration player within the entity group. And actually, I'm hoping that this player will become the central player in entity group. So is there a possibility that the company could be sold off? That possibility is part of any of the many possibilities. However, for myself, I want to make sure that we hang on to entity data so that we'll be able to deliver further synergy for the future. Have I responded to your question? You mentioned the future. What about the timeline? What about the sense of speed? Do you believe that while you're still at the helm of the company, some sort of output or results can be visible? Is that your sense? Yes, I believe it can become visible. For one thing, for example, with Toyota, we are involved in Smart City Initiative, and we're trying to create a platform for entity data development team and entity labs working together to develop such a platform to drive this autonomous drive platform. So therefore, this is going to become part of the platform. We're just talking about platform. So it's important that various systems be implemented, introduced into the cars. And this will require a 5G system to drive this. And managing the system, that requires the capacity of entity communication. So that being the case, something that is the application that is developed by entity data, that could be actually, together with partners outside the group and also with the up companies, be sold off to other players. So entity data is going to be at the core of the B2B2X model. And we believe that this is something that can be delivered within the next couple of years. Thank you very much. If I may add one other word, with Mitsubishi Corporation, we're involved in value change innovation. That also involves NTT data. By expanding that, we believe that IT modernization can be pursued in both wireless and fixed line environment. So this could be driven by NTT data. This could be delivered much earlier on, I believe. Thank you. I just wanted to add that. Thank you very much for that. NTT data. Do they have the willingness to become the central player in NTT Group? I never felt that intention on the part of NTT Data. What about you? Well, it's been 2 years since being the president of NTT, and I've been talking about this quite repeatedly. And I think Mr. Honma, the president of NTT Data, is now having that type of recognition. It's true that in the past, I would say NTT Data should be at the center, but then they would say, no, we want to be at the margins of the group. But right now, that type of discussion is no longer there. They are now saying that, yes, NTT Data is saying that they are considering how they can support NTT in the collaboration. So I think they're gradually coming to the center of NTT Group. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Mr. Kikuchi. Next question is from Macquarie Capital, Mr. Yamashina. Please. Yes, this is Yamashina from Macquarie. Thank you very much. I have a question on the long-term view on R&D. So Docomo, after becoming a wholly owned subsidiary, the Yokosuka and Musashino R&D roles and responsibility in IOWN, are there changes in the roles and responsibilities? Do you have any thinking there? And in IOWN, and the positioning of NTT Data was just asked earlier. NTT Data's positioning in IOWN, how should we understand that? Thank you. Thank you. So first, including Docomo, the holding company's R&D and Docomo's R&D, will mission assignment change? We have not decided on anything. We need to discuss that going forward. It's one of the important agenda items. But I think we need to change. In other words, the basic research will be holding company, R&D, and Docomo combined, a new organization or holding company done by itself. So the fixed line and mobile need to be covered both. So the basic research need to cover both. On the other hand, Docomo will develop service and application and develop areas that are close to our customers. That will be done by Docomo R&D in a more enhanced manner. So Comware and Com R&D members will support that. So I think it will be polarized. In IOWN is very broad-based. NTT Docomo is focusing on wireless format. Next is 6G, but wireless software platform that is integrated behind the scenes. So Shibutani-san talked about the integration. There's this integrated part. So we want to work on that together. And so the mission will change in that direction. And NTT Data's role, the system construction capability and the know-how and capability and expertise. Data has strong expertise there. So NTT Data does not do basic research. Rather, with customers, with partners, the system will be built. And the seeds in the R&D will be captured by data in the downstream. So different from the past, the elemental technology developed in R&D will be developed into a solution. into data by data. For example, the system to detect abnormalities. NTT Data is developing the solutions and sell them. So data can be captured in upstream and downstream. Does this answer your question? Yes, I understand. Thank you.
はい、山科様、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Mr. Yamashina.
次のご質問。
Next question from Daiwa Securities, Mr. Ando. Mr. Ando, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Ando here. I have a question about R&D and ION in particular. It's a very large, very lofty vision. In order to have global talent to commit to this, how do you intend to communicate this? Your ability to provide a narrative. What do you intend to do about it? For example, Interior and NVIDIA. Do you believe that if they work well, then you'll be able to get the global talent, or are you going to create a resource center so that you'll be able to capture global talent? So can you share with us your thoughts, if you will, and your policy about how to capture global talent? Well, in terms of development, I think there's a need to consolidate those centers. That is true. But before we get to that stage, NTT Labs and NTT Docomo need to collaborate. And maybe we could create such a central organization where NTT Docomo and Labs can cooperate. So Center for Development and working with partners, that type of organization will be required. So, and as a precursor to that, ION Development Center, ION Development Office, Development Office is now established with the NTT holding company, and that needs to translate into concrete centers going forward. But as you mentioned to Mr. Ando, to promote that and to provide a narrative so that people can understand what we're doing, that is an area where we have not done sufficiently. Are we going to do this? Based on our own team or not? Quite recently, I hope that we'll be able to make some sort of announcement about what we're going to do. And there's a third element. Right now, domestically, we have enormous amount of facilities, but all photonics network that will be developed through ION, how will this be introduced? When we sell this outside Japan, what type of migration plan can we present and propose? It's important that we set a very concrete implementation plan, and we need a team to promote implementation. So development, promotion, and introduction and delivery. So I think we need 3 types of organization ahead, as we go forward. I hope I've answered your question. Well, in the case of NTT, I know that we can expect a lot from efforts to be made on the part of NTT Holding Company, but your ability to communicate globally based on English language, how do you see your capacity to provide such a narrative in English? Well, we have teams such as NTT Limited and NTT Data team outside Japan that are already out there. But also the ability to promote ION. I think there's a distance between between the two. So are we going to create such an organization or team together with our partners on a joint venture basis? I think we're not yet at that stage. So for the next year or two, it's important that we pursue opportunities whereby we make joint announcements. By the way, in the case of ION Global Forum, everything is conducted in English. All the participants must communicate based on English language. So I believe the members who are participating in the ION probably will not feel any stress about communicating in English. I see. My second question relates to the first question. In the case of optical chips, when it comes to chips, technologically speaking, what type of chips need to be developed? It's very difficult to see from people outside the group. But when we look back in history, behind the development of semiconductor, there's a large contribution from the development of SPEs. So in the case of photonics, in terms of cost reduction and mass production, de facto technology needs to be developed. And you need industries to support this initiative. But what are some of the challenges you see as you try to further spread and develop the required chips down the road? Well, it is as you pointed out. When we take a look at the current semiconductor chips, there are a lot of complicated, long process involved in semiconductors and chips. And the etching component, the etching part, will it be done through electronic form? But no, that's not the case. We want to add photonics component on top of the chips, etching. We don't want to use electronics rather. So in principle, it's a semiconductor type of process. But how do we implement the photonics electronics convergence component? And the device-related technology needs to be developed in parallel. NTT Laboratories and NTT Electronics, that's a subsidiary firm, they're already creating semiconductors. So although they have the ability to develop and produce photonics electronics convergence, although not on a massive scale. So how do we introduce such a line? We have a very small scale line already. So how can we expand that in the future? Naturally, Intel and NVIDIA, both companies are now shifting to fabless production. So how do we identify production technology and with whom? That's going to be a major issue. So yes, I think your question is very much on the mark. Thank you very much for that.
様ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Ando.
次のご質問は
Next question is UBS Securities. Mr. Takahashi, please. Mr. Takahashi, please. Yes, this is Takahashi from UBS. Thank you. I have two questions. First, in the first R&D presentation, the virtualization and IOWN were explained. As business, I think virtualization will be launched sooner as the business. So once again, including your global vendors, we are all moving in the similar direction. So NTT NEC collaboration, where is your strength, your competitive advantage, and what timeline do you have to have a positive impact on your financial results? First of all, the point I would like to communicate is this collaboration with NEC, and we are also discussing with Fujitsu too. So Japanese vendors in 4G and 5G device, we are still small. As Shibutani-san said today, in the vertical integration structure, we had little room to enter because of lack of the sales and engineering. On a global basis, we lack in sales and engineering capability, and we cannot expand this overnight. But O-RAN equipment, there are not so many O-RAN equipment around the world. So O-RAN, if the O-RAN is discussed, many formats will come into play. I cannot name the carriers, but NTT, LEC equipment is one suggestion. In that case, NTT will support as an SI year, and NEC will become the manufacturer, and the software will be combined, and the carrier will be used. So there are no other comparators, if you will. So if the carriers say we want to introduce O-RAN, NEC and Fujitsu have the advantage to begin with. Altiostar, vRAN may be the competitor. So be RU or DUCU, the interface The interoperability is not ensured yet on the software base, so we are still on equal footing. Timeline will be 1 to 2 years. We think this will expand in 1 or 2 years. Thank you. My second question is, core virtualization. So PSTN and IT network will be integrated, you said. So East and West network will be included here. They will also be part of this virtualization. Any legal impediment or obstacles? East and West are now, we are thinking of them as wholesaler. So the basic node wholesale part that East and West uses, and the service part that the mobile carriers will use on top of that. The core software, I think, will be divided into 2. So as has been informed, in 2024, PSTN will be migrated to IP, the FLETS, optical side. But we are talking about that beyond that. So will we use the optical phone forever? No, not really. The communications line phone and Skype phone are already changing. And so the critical voice communication still remains. That's also a fact. So the node, the core net, what kind of combination will be needed? Maybe it will be mobile centered with fixed line critical. But as I said earlier, East and West will have some part, and the operating companies will have the other parts. We think there will be a division. Yes, I understand. Thank you.
様ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Mr. Takahashi.
次のご質問は、
Next question from Merrill Lynch, Mr. Kinoshita. Mr. Kinoshita, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Kinoshita here. I hope you can hear my voice. Yes, we hear you clearly. Thank you very much. I would like to ask several questions, if I may. I know that there have been repeated questions, but it's about ORAN and VRAN. Let me ask a question about your philosophy or thoughts. In principle, NTT Docomo will be positive in addressing ORAN and VRAN, but at the same time, though, Nokia and Ericsson, they are not earnest about this. So at the end of the day, we see the situation being stalled. I think that is the prevailing situation, or that's the image that I have. But in the case of incumbents, they have a certain scale of operation. Nokia, very reluctant to come on board, and Ericsson, who have no intentions. Can you really introduce ORAN with the presence of those carriers? I am somewhat skeptical about the possibility of ORAN and VRAN, so if you could talk about that. Thank you for your question. I suppose that's one way of putting it. When we take a look at the various trends in places like US government authorities understand that ORAN is beginning to move. At the same time, though, they understand the presence of VRAN. But players like Nokia and Ericsson, they already have vertical integrated model, and they're trying to recommend that. And Samsung, in the case of Samsung, Verizon wants to use Samsung. That also represents a bit of vertical integration as well. So I think it's going to really be a competition between these camps. In the case of Dish, it's a combination of RTU. So Will it be ORAN? Will it be VRAN? Will it be a combination? Or will it be vertical integration? I think carriers will continue to lead the situation. It's a combination of which models offer the greatest advantage. In the case of NTT, as a carrier, one of the reasons why we believe ORAN is most positive is because you're able to have control over your software. You're able to strengthen your competitiveness under the ORAN model. And going forward, the hardware will be white box, but value added can be captured. So offering inexpensive hardware dedicated system, that's our intention. So carriers that are in line with this thought probably will come on board for ORAN. Or maybe they'll skip ahead to VRAN eventually, perhaps. But I know that this is not a direct response to your question. You mentioned that you're skeptical. This will be all determined by the market. It will be determined by the competition, and we have to make sure that we don't lose out in this competition. Let me go back to what your comment. Docomo has the technological capacity, but non-Japanese carriers, do they have sufficient ability to control softwares? Well, the carriers in developed countries, they want to be able to exercise control over their software. That seems to be the situation. But outside Japan, carriers and vendors are very close, and the management team actually hop between the two. So there's a different factor at play. In the case of developing economies, they probably have a preference for full turnkey. That's a possibility. But at the end of the day, it's all about cost performance. So security, whereby you're able to exercise your own control, or a free hand, whereby you'll be able to drive growth. What is the trade-off between the two, control and growth? So right now, a very limited number of developed economies perhaps are involved in this whole discussion. I see, point taken. Second question, let me confirm. This goes back to Mr. Ando's question earlier. In the case of optical chips, photonics chips, as far as the chips are concerned, you mentioned that competition is primarily with existing systems who are able to extend their limitation. Is that the case? Is that the only competition that you have? Also, when you produce optical or photonics chips, are there other potential production methodologies? And is there a possibility that a different type of production methodology could emerge as a competition to the current photonics chips? Is there a possibility that you'll not be able to take the lead and that you'll lose out from benefiting from a mass scale production? If you could clarify the situation for us. Thank you for that. In the case of photonics electronics converged chips, NTT was covered by Nature's article last year. And the reason why Nature, the journal, covered this is because this is already being implemented. And IBM, Huawei, these players, in relation to digital signal processing, wanted to adopt photonics electronics convergence. I understand that they actually produced this. But then they were not able to spread that technology. So technological breakthrough needs to make sure that on top of silicon, photonics be introduced. How do you place photonics on top of the silicon? So NTT has that edge. So the competition, in terms of competition within photonics electronics convergence, NTT is one step ahead, without a doubt. Also, as mentioned by Mr. Shibutani earlier, we're talking about 6 nano to 7 nano universe. We're talking about the edging. But this could probably come down to 2 nanos eventually. So the level of concentration could actually improve. However, the situation with regard to temperature will still remain. So energy consumption, power consumption, is the key. So after photonics electronics convergence is delivered, it's a matter of power consumption. It's a trade-off. So within photonics electronics convergence, we are ahead. In terms of comparison with existing chips, it's a discrepancy between the performance. But the limit will come. So eventually, photonics electronics convergence will probably go ahead compared to the existing chips. I see. Thank you. Then in terms of your technology pertaining to photonics, electronics convergence, I know that you have not disclosed this, but unless you have a third-party manufacturer and involved industries, the base for this technology probably will not spread. Are you going to consider licensing for this technology? Is that the case? Yes, I take your point, but we're not yet at that stage. And also, we talked about photonics, electronics, converged chips. The first usage will probably be in the digital signal processing, but the interposer needs to be converted into photonics, and then later on, we need multi-layer for the chips. That model is already visible. So placing photonics, electronics, converged material on top of the silicon, it will come later. So what type of value chain will be created for the industry? That needs to be organized beforehand. So let me rephrase this. So interposer connecting chips. Interposer will probably be developed within the next couple of years. We have to consider whether or not we're going to produce this and see this as an industry. So it's important that with players like Intel and NVIDIA, we discuss that. My personal view is that maybe, hopefully, we'll have the ability to produce that eventually. It's not yet determined. Is the possibility that you will become a fab? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we already have a fab that's carried out by one of our subsidiary firms. But this is limited to chips for the... It's only limited to... We already delivered that to Huawei. But because of the National Defense Authorization Act question, we stopped delivering that to Huawei last year. But we are manufacturers, so we have that ability. Please bear that in mind. Thank you.
はい、木下様、ありがとう。
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinoshita.
次のご質問。
Next question is from Citigroup Securities, Mr. Tsuruo. Mr. Tsuruo, please. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. This may digress from today's topic, but I want to ask you a question about the power in the resource. You will do the offshore wind power generation, you said. So as of now, including J-Power, in the power generation, what kind of investment are you thinking of in the next 10 years? So J-Power, what kind of return are you thinking of? Or the power source development. So the regional grid, we want to do this direct current. Anode. This is the one terminal on direct current, so that is the basis. So in power generation, there was some miscommunication. So power distribution was how the mass media understood and wrote the articles on. But we will work on the power generation, the renewable energy, and that will be 600 billion in 10 years. But this is not 600 billion. This is not just our own cash. We will work with partners and to take this off balance and go up to 600 billion. Right now, it's a little less than 300 billion. Profit, but in its resale. So by having the power source, we can improve the operating margin. But because of the nature of the power, this will not go up that significantly. So in the next 10 years, we will use renewable energy. We only use 4%. So we will rise this to 30% and deliver this through anode. And so use that as a base load and and when the oil supply stops, we can generate power on our own. So that is the energy vision along with the environment vision, and this has started. Understood. Thank you very much. Another different theme. If you cannot answer, that's fine, because it's during TOB, but NTT Docomo on the subscriber base is largest, but are third player in terms of profit. So there's a structural problem in price. So that was the price if you align yourselves with other parties. So Sawada-san and NTT executives, what do you think is the opportunity in your cost structure? So first, others have the long distance and international and wireless together. In case of Docomo, when it separated in 1992, the facilities had to be owned by themselves. That was ordered by the rule. But this time, this discussion on Docomo was judged that it is not a legal judgment, and therefore Com's backbone is the largest in long distance, and Docomo backbone want to be combined, integrated. And buildings, Docomo is newer, so Docomo's building will be used as node, and Com will be integrated into that. So the first point is the total cost of facility. Group can work to reduce the cost there. Second is IT system. This is also a discussion centering on cost reduction. We have a company called Docomo Systems, and the ERP that is developed there is used within the group. In the next few years, SAP, we are trying to shift to SAP Cloud, and Comware will drive this. Docomo Systems and Comware need to be discussed. So collaborate or merge or combine. By combining them, we can reduce more cost. And we want to start studying that. At this point, I just have this in my brain. We have not discussed it yet. But these facilities and IT cost reduction can be possible. I understand. Thank you very much.
鶴尾様ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Tsuru. I'm afraid that the time to complete the session has come. Our apologies, but this will be the final question for the session. We apologize. Next question from Nomura Securities, Mr. Masuno. Mr. Masuno, you have the floor. Mr. Masuno, I think you're on mute. Oh yes, my apologies. Thank you very much. I know that this is the final question. My question is this. It's not so much about NTT, but inclusive of... I want to talk about the future of the IT industry, telecom industry, inclusive of your competition. Well, with fixed line broadband spreading, and with the smartphones having 80% penetration, and there is a price-related pressure. But in the case of open internet, new smartphone-based data payment is now emerging, and we see enormous payment business emerging, and they're converging. And retail power contents are now being integrated in the form of super applications. So in terms of this consumer-related trend, how should telecom industry change going forward? That's my first question. My second is about business. We're now in the 5G, 6G era. And I think it's only natural that fixed and mobile network be converged. And if you put on top of that data center, then network added value will increase. And also large data cloud data service operators are now beginning to come into this area. So against this business environment, how should the telecom industry change? How should they address this ongoing trend? I would appreciate your thoughts about the industry as a whole. Thank you very much. Let me talk about the retail individual users. Docomo is pushing, of course, the smart life business. In the case of fixed line business, in the case of mobile as well, they try to generate profit. And now the rate, the prices is based on flat rate, not so much usage rate. It's not so much based on usage rate system. Once the market becomes mature, you shift to a flat rate system. But the upper layer contents and payment business naturally is emerging. On the other hand, in the case of payment, it's all about finance and money, and there's going to be a lot of demand. In the case of healthcare, it's about life. This is also going to be a very major segment. And also the emotion and the mental universe. In other words, how do you deepen communication? And the other is about comfort, a sense of comfort. So then we come to robotics. So this also involves mobility as well. So in order to make individuals' lives more safe and secure, and even richer from that perspective, up until now, elements that were outside the telecom industry is now begun to be part of this university. So that I believe is the situation of the discussion pertaining to the consumer side of the business. So telecommunication is simply one of the elements. In the case of healthcare, medical, it's very important. It's very large. Wearable devices are very now increasing, and if implantable devices are to be incorporated, the situation will really change. On the other hand, when it comes to business, as you pointed out, what we're offering as cloud is primarily private cloud, and it's very customized. In the case of public cloud, we were involved in public cloud, but AWS, Google, and Azure, we could not be victorious against those players. So we shifted our thinking, and we decided to offer this as a hybrid fashion. And we decided to deliver solutions that offer a hybrid. But that alone would not be sufficient to compete against these giants. But these are players in the application front that really have global dominance. In the case of Aura and vRAN, how comes after Aura and vRAN? They're beginning to engage in the software side of the equation. So I believe that so I'm saying that we should compete against these players because they are now entering the telecom field. Why do we need to compete with them? Because I think the telecom industry's weight in the business community will increase going forward. For example, all things will be connected. And this applies to autonomous drive as well. It applies to the functions in the cities and urban settings. It also applies to implantable devices and all the aspects of individuals' lives. So offering connection and platforms. These players are trying to make platforms their own. So as far as telecom carriers are concerned, it's important that we offer those platforms on our own to the world. So therefore, that is going to be the competition going forward. So communication for the business, this is going to be essential. This is the most essential component as we try to deliver value. I hope we're on the same page. Yes, thank you. In terms of consumers, it's a very detailed question, I apologize. But in terms of consumers, when it comes to the new approach, I think healthcare and life is going to be very important, especially in post-COVID-19 universe. And also in terms of business dealings with business, as you pointed out right now, we have no idea who is controlling the software. Is it the vendors, or is it the service operators? So I think that's the universe that we're headed to. So how you dominate the market is going to be very critical. Yes, thank you very much. I take your point. So yes, trying to take the piece of the market. Is it going to be the manufacturers, or is it going to be the likes of GAFA, or is it going to be the conventional traditional carriers, or is it going to be even customers, or is it going to be devices like Apple? I think all possible scenarios are out there. And this applies to both the business market and to the mass market. So as you pointed out, Mr. Masuno, I think we are beginning to see global competition that is transcending barriers and boundaries. And the focus is going to be on this type of global competition that transcends various boundaries. Thank you very much for that.
With that, we will close the Q&A session. President Sawada, thank you very much. Thank you.